Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Lexie Smyth. I'm the fiction category manager here at Barnes& Noble, and with me today is Jenna Seery, who is the associate producer of the Poured Over podcast. And we are absolutely thrilled to be in conversation with Susan Rieger, the author of our November book club selection, Like Mother, Like Mother. If you sent in questions via the Eventbrite, Jenna and I have them, and you can also submit questions via the Q&A module, which Jenna and I will be moderating. As a reminder, this is a conversation with spoilers. We will be talking about everything here. But if you haven't finished the book, you can always come back later, as this will be posted on the Barnes& Noble YouTube channel. Now that we've got all the housekeeping out of the way, let's get started.
Okay. Susan, thank you so much for being with us. We're so excited to talk about this book. I have to start with a question that came up quite a bit with the Eventbrite. So I know there's people out there who are wondering this as well. And I think it's a great place to start the conversation. I was hoping we could talk a little bit about your path to becoming a novelist and your path to this story in general.
I have had a kind of accidental career. I went to law school originally, and like many people who go to law school, I wound up not practicing. I had a baby right afterwards, and I couldn't see spending 80 hours a week doing the practice of law. And so I had a job. I had had a job before law school at Columbia Admissions, so I did that for a year afterwards, and then I taught some at a law school, and then I moved to Amherst and I taught some more at undergraduate schools. And then I went to Yale, where I was a dean of one of the undergraduate colleges, which was the making of me. It was just a wonderful job. And then I moved to Columbia for another job as in the provost's office there. And I had actually started writing in 1999, which is when my first book begins, The Divorce Papers. I had been at Yale then for about 7 years, and I needed something else to do. I always need something else to do. And when I had been teaching, I had had to make up a moot court docket, which is what the students argue. And I thought, this is so much fun. I should make a novel about this. And so, 25 years later, I started writing a novel, and I wrote an epistolary legal novel. And then when I sold that, I stopped working. I was 67 years old, and when it was published, and I decided, well, I can afford mentally and financially to make my way as a writer. And I published my second one, which is a more conventional novel. And then I just did my third one, and I'm working on my fourth.
I love that journey. It is always so interesting to hear about how people end up where they do and the journeys it takes and all the different things that sort of add in to what makes their career as a writer. And especially in this book where I think you can see a lot of those influences appear.
Speaking
Well,
of the book, one of the first things I wanted to ask you about is that you open the novel in a pretty bold way. Like one of the main characters is dead. It opens with her funeral. And I'm so curious if you knew from the start when you were writing this novel that Lila's death would be the start of the book.
somebody at Goodreads once said in a column talking about some novel she didn't like too much, she said, I don't know, it seems like the author just made it up as she went along. And to tell you the truth, I made it up as I went along. I'm never quite sure where it's going. I started with that first page with Lila's funeral, and that gave me Lila. And then it gave me Grace, and it gave me Joe. And from there on, the story, and Ruth, and the story just propelled itself. And I never know how it's going to end. The big mystery at the ending of this was what happened to Zelda, as much as there's a mystery. And my husband said, you can't make it not a mystery. You have to make it a mystery. He's a writer too. And I knew that, but I didn't know how to do it. And then I found a way to do it by making Zelda who she was.
Did
But
you
go on.
I was gonna say, I love the character of Lila so much. She's so interesting. She's unlike any character I think I've read before. at first I definitely vacillated between, do I like this person? Do I not like this person? Does it matter? I'm so intrigued as I went along. How did you find her voice? Was she there the whole time?
You know, my favorite book when I was young, 11, 12, was Jane Eyre, because I had never read a novel about somebody who was so abrupt and outspoken and clear thinking, and I loved it. And I've always liked bad behavior of a certain sort, not terrible to other people, but strong-minded, what other people might think of as bad behavior. And Lila is somewhat ruthless. Um, I don't know, that it always comes back to it. I always say that there would be no Lila Pereira without Roma Giovannitti, who is my mother. Um, and my mother did not have a great big career, and my mother was not utterly ruthless, but she was like she was Lila like. I can say that she was Lila like. She never looked back, and kept secrets, never looked back. So I think I didn't know I was writing from that part, but you have to write from some part of you. You can make it up, but even as you make it up, all the edges are you. Somebody said, "Who?" In one of my books, "Who are the characters in the book?" And I said, "Well, they're all me. I mean, who else could they be?"
I love hearing that the book started with Lila, Joe, Grace, and Ruth because those are some of the characters that I found the deepest connection with. And I really want to talk about Lila and Joe's marriage because it's one of the more unique marriages I've read about in literature. Um, you know, Lila lets Joe know early on that if he wants kids, he's kind of on his own in terms of the bulk of the parenting. And this is treated, culturally as sort of this shocking thing, this strange choice. But if the opposite were true, their marriage would be considered normal if Lila was the one who was doing the bulk of the parenting. Um, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you wrote the marriage and how you decided it would impact their children, because it impacts them all differently.
Yeah. Um, when you have someone like Lila who has emerged the way she is, she's not going to be a mother. At one point, she even says, you know, she says, "I'm like the father, and Joe's like the other father." Uh, but Joe is much more available than she. I don't know many marriages like that, but it seemed to me it was absolutely fitting for Lila to have that kind of marriage. And she married a man who absolutely adored her. And even when they separate, he adores her. And the Starbirds talk about their parents' marriage while they're split, and they said, um, they're the most important people to each other in their lives, even though Lila isn't always considerate of Joe. Um, but she does love him, and when they break briefly, she woos him back. She does all the wooing. She needs him in her life. He's kind of her ballast. I think she was very lucky that she found someone like Joe. She had great good luck. She had terrible luck, and then she had great good luck, which I think happens in a lot of lives. Sometimes the other way.
I'm curious why the unique marriage they had impacted Grace more than it did the Starbirds. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, the Starbirds had each other. And Joe at once says, if I had been a real mother to them, I would have sent them to different schools. I would have not let them have the same bedroom and stuff like that. But it really eased the way. And the Starbirds know that about themselves. They know that they're comical, they're very smart, and they just had each other. That was the most important relationship in their lives with with each other growing up. And and in fact, when they propose to their dad, they propose as a pair that they'll both go and live with him. Um, Grace comes 7 years later. She thinks she may be an accident, which she likely was, and she just feels more alone. The Stybirds go off to college. They go off to high school. They're never in the same school together. And she sees other mothers coming to school. She notices things more. In their cheerfulness, the Starbirds didn't. But she has a different temperament. She has a temperament very much like her mother's. At one point, Lila says to Grace, um, says about Grace, she says, Grace is very much like me, but I'm nothing like Grace, which I think is sort of a kind of summing up then. So I think it impacts on Grace. And when Grace goes to college and meets Ruth, she says at some point to her dad, I understand for the first time what the Starbirds had with each other. And she knows that maybe if she had had that growing up, she wouldn't be so angry at her mother, but or hurt. I can't, or I don't know. Angry and hurt sort of go together often, and so that's the way she is. And Lila understands, but is well, it's not a sympathetic sort. She certainly isn't empathetic, because if she can't feel like other people, she can only feel like herself. Um, I don't know how selfish she does think at one point she's being very selfish, that she's always gotten her own way. Um, and her regret is very brief. She thinks she did what she had to do. She feels she did what she had to do, which is what Grace, I think, comes to recognize.
I think it's really interesting to watch Grace, especially when she's younger, and the different stages she goes through with wishing or wondering what life would have been like with a more conventional mother. Like when Lila says, "I don't know what those mothers do." And it really makes you think. I think this book takes a very different approach to how do mothers learn to parent. What makes an acceptable mother, and why is everyone always so concerned about what mothers do in comparison to fathers or other relatives? And I wondered if that was sort of in your mind as you were writing this idea of what makes a conventional mother.
Well, I mean, as Lila says to Joe at one point, who would have children with me? My mother disappeared when I was 2. My father was terrible, brutal. I had my siblings. They yes, and as Joe said, they made you human. Um, she didn't want children. I think part of being a decent mother is wanting children, or imagining children, or thinking children might be a good idea. But that was never in her mindset, and she was astounded. They were about to get married when Joe introduced the subject of children. Um, and and she was just true to that. But what she did do, and it is something my mother did too, she always treated her children like persons. She talked to them. She thought they were sentient beings. She thought they were interesting. She wanted to know what they thought. In that way, she treated them pretty much like everyone else. Um, and that was very hard on Grace. But when she has certain conversations with Grace, which shows that she's paying attention to who Grace is. When Grace says, maybe I'll go to Stanford, and her mother says, no, you can't go to Stanford. You need weather. And she meant sort of more, she meant it emotionally as well as, climate wise. It's, I think, I think, I wanted a child very much. And my children absolutely lived up to all expectations. That still doesn't mean that they don't think I'm a difficult mother. Huh. So there you are. I often say about my grandchildren that I don't love them more than my children, but they are the easiest loves of my life. We can just love each other very simply. I don't know. My mother was an interesting mother. I don't know that I would have become a writer without my mother, without having those kinds of conversations I had with her.
I love being able to see the different ways that Violet is able to connect with her children. She makes a pretty good show of thinking, oh, we have this very specific relationship, and yet she does find these ways in. I think especially with Grace and their work, I love watching them come together on this very specific thing that means so much to both of them. And even at Lila's death, when they're able to have this last connection, and Lila says, I need you to investigate this for me. I need you to do what we do for us. And I love that connection that they're able to have.
I think Lila, especially when Grace tries her hand at novel writing, which turns out not to have been such a good idea for her or for anyone. But I think Lila thought that newspaper work would be a good direction for Grace to go. And, that's the old Nepo baby thing. And Grace always says, if I was Grace Pereira, it would be easier to get a job. But they do have a real relationship over writing, and they talk about writing. And at one point, when Grace is having trouble getting a new job, Lila says, keep going, you'll get one, you're good, you know how to write. And then at some point, she does write, I think it's the writing about the oligarch's wife, and she praises that. And also the write about the admissions guy who gets children into New York private schools. They have good talks about that. And so Grace feels very supported in her own working life. And I think in her personal life, that's where the repercussions are. For so many women, it's the other around. They maybe feel more comfortable in their personal lives, and their working lives fill them with conflict. I don't think Grace feels at all conflicted about her personal life. But I love it when at the end, you love your own stuff, when Grace is talking to Clara and she says, how are things going with the baby? And Grace says, well, I'm not afraid of her anymore, which I think a lot of mothers feel about a newborn. Will I drop her? Will she break? Will I be a complete failure at this? It's new territory for Grace. Grace has to learn to be a mother without having a mother, whereas she learned to be a writer by having a mother who was a writer.
And I love the connection they have about old movies. This was one of my absolute favorite parts of the book. As someone who themselves connected with their mother and grandmother over old movies and this era of silver screen and golden age, all of this. I love that, especially the reference to one of my favorite and I think often overlooked films, Desk Set. Um,
Yes.
so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about researching those things and the choice to put that in there.
Well, it is one of the things my mother used to do. Is there were three of us, and I was the middle. And if there was a movie that she thought we should see on television, she would let us stay up or even get us up to watch it, because we didn't, there weren't, you couldn't stream, you couldn't get a disc. You had to wait until some television mogul decided to screen it. So I remember watching with her The African Queen. I remember watching The Philadelphia Story. And I think the first one we watched with her, because she always loved it, was Casablanca, which uh, which remains a huge, huge favorite of mine. And so I just became someone who loved old movies. I discovered Desk Set on my own because I had done some other Tracy Hepburn movies. And a middle-aged romance is really so wonderful. People should see more of those to see how you can not get along and get along. Yeah, I love Desk Set. Of all, and the movie that was in my head for some reason, I guess because it was about journalism, was His Girl Friday. The dialogue between the two of them, it's very snippy, snappy, stiletto heels on the sidewalk, and that was just in my head the whole time I was writing, which explains, I think, some of the dialogue that sort of repeats that. People in the movies in the 30s, 40s, 50s were much snappier. Dialogue was much more important to movies. Yeah, so I love old movies, and I still watch them. My my husband actually has not seen Desk Set yet, and says he should, and we keep putting it off. But maybe one day we'll get to it. He loves old movies. He was watching The Lady Eve the other night when he couldn't sleep.
For me, it was the Thin Man movies. That was what really got me back in the day. And I think dialogue is incredibly important in this book. There is a lot of conversation back and forth. And I think that is where we get so much of the connection between the characters. Do you have a process for writing dialogue? Do you speak it aloud? Do you have a way of reading it to sort of make it ring true?
Oh, everything I write, at some point I read it out loud in my head, or sometimes I read it out loud. I wanted to use dialogue the same way. The book, I'm anti-chronological, as you discovered in my book. I jump back and forth. And uh, I do that because I think when you meet a person, you sit down with someone, you don't start talking about the day you were born and then slowly go through fifth grade, junior high, high school. I wanted to introduce my characters the way you're introduced to other people. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but that's the way my mind works. I'm often moving sideways. And and so I wanted also we know people not from their inner thoughts. We know them from how they behave towards us. So I have very little inner thoughts. I wanted people to get to know my characters from how they behaved, what they said. Um, what's that great line from Maya Angelou? When somebody shows you who they are, believe him. I sort of that's sort of one of my mantras. Show me who you are, and I'll believe you.
I think your characters do a great job of that. The actions, the dialogue, they feel so real. And one of the characters that I really want to talk about is Ruth. Um, she is such a breath of fresh air to this family. She's really able to be direct not only with Grace, but with many other members of the family, including Frances, including Joe, including Lila, in a way that I don't, even though this is a family that's pretty open, she's able to be direct with them in a way they're not necessarily able to be direct with each other. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you wrote Ruth, but also what you think it is about her that allows for this directness with them.
No, I introduced Ruth very briefly in the beginning when she's rather brusque with um, after the funeral service. But I introduced her basically when they're freshmen and they're talking to each other late at night, and their stories come up, and that sort of set the tone of who Ruth was. She's very sensible. We discover as it goes on that she's much more anxious than we thought she might have been, uh, but she also sees very clearly she had the benefit of having a great mother, except it was her grandmother who raised her. And her grandmother is funny and interesting and has a flexible mind. And so I think she went out into the world with a certain kind of confidence of a truly loved child who wasn't spoiled, but was trusted to be who she was. Um, and so I always have, I have my closest friend in the world is somebody who's always bringing me down. Um, and I always have needed a friend like that. My college roommate was like that. She always brought me down. I tend to be more Grace-like um, than Ruth-like. Uh, and I need someone like Ruth in my life. And so therefore I invented Ruth. And then, it's fun. You have her grow up in a different town. You have her go to different school. And one of the great things about Ruth is that I knew nothing about Florida or Tallahassee, and I had to do research. And when you're a fiction writer and things aren't going so well, you go to Professor Google and you start looking up, all these things. Detroit too. It's very good to have things in areas you don't know because you learn about them, and it also provides you with a break from writing, which I always think I need.
Can you talk a bit about your research for this novel? We have some questions in the chat about your research about Detroit. I'd love to hear about your research about Florida and also about the newspaper business because you're very detailed about all of those things.
Yeah. Um, Detroit, I did read, it's all Professor Google. I had to find it that way. And I looked about neighborhoods. I looked, what the population was. I looked when the riots were. So I've never been to Detroit. And one of the great compliments I got from my book is a good friend of mine who grew up in Detroit and said, "How did you know about that?" And I said, you know, it's easy to find out these days. I could never have done it, 30 years ago. Um, and the only thing he said, you did everything. He said, but nobody called it the Eloise. It was only called Eloise about the asylum. I said, okay, okay. I don't think I made that up, but I'm willing to defer to a native Detroiter. And the same way with Florida. I also had to make up a Southern family and put them in that environment. I do recommend introducing characters from foreign countries, and for me, Detroit and Florida are kind of foreign. I'm very urban, very New York, uh, and that's in my first book. Though I made up a state. I made up the state of Narragansett because it was all about divorce law, and I didn't want lawyers telling me, "Well, you really can't do that. That's not really how a divorce goes." And I could say, in Narragansett, that's how it goes. So sometimes the great thing about novel writing, you have the freedom to make up a state and also to go and look for something you don't know. Um, I forgot the second part of your question. I don't know.
If you could tell us a bit about the research you did about the newspaper
Oh, the
business, that
newspaper.
would be fascinating.
I always thought I would work for a newspaper. Growing up, I worked on all my newspapers: elementary school, junior high school, high school, college, and then I arrived, out of college after the '60s, and I felt I just was the civil rights movement and the women's movement were very much in my head, and I decided I'd go to law school, which was really the right place for me. Um, every so often I'm sort of very good at doing taxes. I'm pretty logical, and my husband says, "Oh, you law school gave you that." I said, "No, that's why I was good at law school because I was always like that. I was an English major. I was a very horrible English major. I loved to read, but I didn't like to think too seriously about books. Um, so the newspaper business, I have friends who are journalists, and I worked for a newspaper. In my accidental career, I can't mention everything I've ever done, but I worked for the Berkshire Eagle for a while doing a column, and I worked for the Hartford Courant doing a column, and I've written for a lot of newspapers, and I know a lot of news people. Um, and I've seen a lot of, I saw, All the President's Men and Spotlight. I love all those newspaper movies. Um, so I didn't do real research in that. I felt comfortable talking about it. I read newspapers. I read the Times every day, though I'm mad at them. And I read the Washington Post, which I'm not mad at the moment. So, uh, and I sometimes read The Guardian. And people say I should read the Wall Street Journal. And sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. But I really do. I hope sort of daily journalism, the way papers do it, continues. The onslaught of what's on the web is just sometimes kills me. Um, I just can't keep up with it, and I don't watch television. I don't. I feel and it's what it's so much analysis, um, and and as uh, Lila says, analysis is just opinion dressed up in a tuxedo. Um, and she wants news, hard news, the red meat. Um, a journalist, a well-known journalist I know, Michael Kinsey, used to say that if you want to know what's really happening in government and federal government, you have to read the Washington Post. The red meat is on the table. So, I mean, I steal a lot too, but all right, amateurs borrow, professionals steal.
I do also want to talk about Frances because she is a character who looms large in this book, and she is, in fact, a mother who I would say mothers in a more typical way, um, but it's a bit overbearing at times. And I'm wondering, is this the kind of mothering that people need? Is it what we would expect from someone like this? I just love to hear a bit about how you wrote Frances because I think about her a lot.
I have to say I love Frances. I love her clarity. I like her briskness. I like she knows what she thinks. And as Joe says about her, she's wonderful and generous and all those things. But like every rich person, she's used to getting her own way. Um, and she says that about herself at one point when he says, "You should have gone to law school." And she says, "No, no, I hate conflict." And she said, "I don't know what I should have done, but whatever it was, I should have been the boss." And that's part of Frances's temperament. She was widowed very, very young, and I don't think she minded that at all. And I think she raised Joe. We don't ever see those years, but I think she raised him to think for himself and be independent. And I think she was a good mother for a boy. Um, I don't know. You can be a good mother for both, and I don't know to what extent they're different. I don't know that I treated my kids differently, but I must have. Uh, one played sports, one didn't. Guess who? I mean, and we tried to get both of them to play, but I remember my daughter at one point said to me, "This is going sideways," which I always do. When I said, "Gee, when I was young, we only could play half court basketball, and they discouraged girls from playing sports." And she puts her hand up like this. She's about 11. Oh, she says, "Oh, to be a girl of the 50s. That's my kid." And whereas my son was practically semi-professional in tennis. Uh, but she's I love her, and I love her story about her romance, her original romance, and how it was frustrated by her father, um, the jealous father. Uh, I think people have parents like that, um, and um, and I love the way Ruth figures out how to treat her, how to talk to her. Everybody, everybody else sort of succumbs to Frances. Frances gets her way. I don't, yeah, she's bossy, but I think she's bossy in the nicest way, by, well, not spreading money about. Whereas Ruth can't be bossed, which is, Ruth has a kind of core of independent thinking that I think she knows who she is, and she knows who she is pretty early. And a lot of us don't really know who we are until we're older, much older. Um, Even now, I sometimes surprise myself and I say, well, where did that come from? But I think I know pretty much who I am. Uh, but so Frances and Ruth are good for each other, I think, particularly.
I loved their relationship. That initial scene at breakfast, just it sticks with me. I think about it all the time.
She didn't let she didn't let Frances take over the conversation. And the way she talks to Joe when she's worried about him. Everybody else sort of tiptoes around him and says maybe he should move or buy a light for the apartment. And she says flat out she's worried about him. Um, and she doesn't care about the repercussions. She's never unkind. Um, and oh, the funniest thing is I found I get an alert from Google, and there's an alert from a therapy group where they talk about like mother, and about people who have difficulty saying "I love you." And I thought, huh, I've become a therapist, an accidental therapist. And that scene where she's trying to get Grace to admit she loves Xander, and also to admit she loves Grace, and Grace, of course, admits it, and then gets furious and attacks Ruth back. But Ruth can take it. It's amazing. I think she was so well loved. She knows she will be loved. Um, and I think that's probably her grandmother. I think is probably the greatest gift. And as her grandmother says, I was finally old enough to raise a child.
I love the different kinds of relationships we see, and yet so many of them are between maternal figures and their daughters. We don't have a lot of these relationships between mother and son, and we have a question in the chat about Polo and what if he had been able to have an interaction with his mother and if he had been there later on to connect with his family in that way.
I've always thought that for Polo, who saw how his mother was treated and felt the helplessness of a small child, and even when um, I think I don't know that Zelda is the mother you want for Polo, uh, as she turned out. I mean, um, but um, but I don't. I think he of course suffered the most. I think from their childhood because Lila was who she was. I think Lila says she was probably like her dad. Her his and she said his father beat him and he beat me and he said it made a man of him and I suppose it made a man of me too. Um, she could take it. She didn't want to go through life afraid, and I don't think Polo felt afraid. I think he felt guilty the way children do feel guilty for things their parents do or didn't do. Um, yeah, he's sort of heartbreaking. And Clara, and it's interesting that Clara and he, he was the knight and she was the saint, and Grace was and Lila was the hoodlum. Uh, that that Lila made a life for herself the way her siblings couldn't, growing up in that violent house. But they all made sure they didn't repeat it. That's what they did. And I love it when the Starbirds notice that. They say, to Grace, that Grace never notices that Lila never hit them. Nyla may have been negligent, but she never was mean to them. She never teased them. So Polo was damaged, I think, and felt very bad about it. And I think he was more scared because he had seen his mother brutalized.
I think one of the things that really sticks with me about this book is that a lot of these characters, in their own way, are survivors of things that happened to them. For both Lila and Zelda, being an absent mother is a form of survival. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the connection you see between motherhood and survival or being a survivor.
Yeah. It's an imagined world for me because my parents never hit us. We were the children who were sent to our room, and when we were ready to apologize, we could come out. And I tended to stay the longest in the room. I I didn't much like saying I was sorry. I've gotten better at it as I've gotten older. So there was none of that. So it was imagined. And I feel that when you grow up in a violent home, it's going to influence you your whole life. It's very hard. You can have all the therapy in the world, and I don't know that you can ever get rid of it. And and they learned how to escape their dad finally when they were older, but I mean they but 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 I think I just think it just marks you. And I think, and Clara said she didn't become a mother, and she and Polo were the most important people to each other because they could trust each other and they knew each other and they understood who they were. Um, and but as Grace says at one point, she said if Clara had been my mother, that would have been great, and then I could easily love Aunt Lila. Um, but but Clara couldn't do it. I do. I don't. It's pretty much imagined. I have read a lot of, at one point in my life, I read a lot about psychoanalysis and psychology, um, and it seems to me that the physical marks are often not the ones that really stay. It's the mental deformity that can come from being beaten and abused.
I think another theme that I've noticed both in this conversation and in the book is, people who look back versus people who look forward in their lives. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think that impacts one's way of being a mother.
Oh, I think I think I don't how it impacts being a mother. I think it impacts your whole life. In some ways, if you're somebody who looks back and someone who does, my mother, as I said, was not one to look back. I mean, she told stories the way Lila did. She would tell stories about her father and her mother, but she never looked back. And my father was more likely to look back. I mean, he was in the 50s. He was in psychoanalysis, which was, I think, in the 50s, a lot of people were in psychoanalysis, and but he never talked about his own growing up. But I think he was very much neglected. He was the youngest of five, parents very poor, and so he had a hard time. Um, you know, I was somebody who looked back a lot. In fact, my older sister says to me, "I don't remember anything of my childhood. If I couldn't talk to you, I wouldn't know what happened." And so I think that's a difference. I do remember a lot, and I spent 10 years in analysis, and that was the great cure of looking back. I decided, okay, spend 10 years looking back. I'm going to be forward thinking now. And now, maybe psychoanalysis was the gift um, of novel writing. Is that after that I could look back in a different way. I could make my own history into fiction. I mean, I'm inescapable when I'm writing. There I am. But it become I hadn't thought about that, but it's a different way of looking back and a way of trying to sort out things that you never quite completely sorted out. So yeah, looking back. Lila doesn't look back.
She certainly doesn't.
Zelda doesn't look back. No. And Grace only looks back in a very specific way. Grace, if she wants to grow up, has to give up her grievances. I think that we all have to do that. I always felt when my kids turned 30 that the statute of limitations have run. Did what I could. It wasn't always the best, but I did what I could. So
That actually leads me to my next question. The final lines of the book were just so wonderful when, Grace was saying, no one protected Lila from Aldo, but no one protected Zelda from him either. They did what they had to do. They did what they could. I'd love to hear you talk a bit about how our perspective on our parents can change over time. What are the changes that happened in Grace's life that allowed her to see her mother in a new light?
I, what I think, I think her mother had to die. I sometimes think we have to bury our parents twice. The first time is when we put them in the ground, and the second time is when we say they're never going to change. They're never going to change. And sometimes they have to be dead for you to face it. Um, so I think her mother dying, in a way, freed Grace to think about the relationship in a different way. And I think finding Zelda made her see her mother um, in more sympathetic terms. I think, I mean, my mother lived to be very, very old. So, you know, I had to get used to her in some way before she died because she was 92. But I think for Grace Zelda's, I don't, I never know quite what I'm doing, but it really turns out that that Lila dying is the thing that propels Grace into growing up finally at 30. I think 30 is a very important year for most women. Um, you know, I think you have to sort of say, I'm a grown up. Uh, I've been a grown up maybe for 5 years already, but I didn't. I was just sort of faking it, you know.
Susan, this has been such a wonderful conversation. We're approaching the end of our time here, but there's one question I always like to ask authors that I'm going to wrap up with, which is, what, if anything, do you want your readers to take away from Like Mother, Like Mother?
Oh, well, I want them to like it. I want them to like it. I want them to see, I suppose I want them to see the truth in it. I did try to write what I thought was true. And some of it's imagined and some of it's remembered and some of it I saw from other people. But I think it is a true story that was completely made up.
I love that so much. These characters felt so real to me. I loved spending time with them. Thank you so much for writing such a wonderful book. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for this conversation. And thank you to all of the book club readers who joined us today for your questions, for your time. And thank you for joining us throughout the year. This is our last virtual book club of 2024. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of it, Susan. And we'll see you all again in February of next year. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.